Well, welcome, Gary Bracey,
Thank
ex-development director of Ocean, and in probably what was called well, I would agree would be the golden years of the company. But you started off in retail, didn't you, Gary?
Yes, that was the only way at the time I could get employed. I was a trainee manager at Littlewoods chain stores. That was the beginning of my career, which was actually quite educational in its way. My parents were hugely disappointed. They wanted me to be a lawyer, and I got the necessary qualifications to go for law in university, but I just wanted to get out into the big bold world and start making some money, and so I could go clubbing and drinking and everything else. I got my priorities right. So yeah, I applied for a job as trainee manager in Littlewoods, and I became departmental manager in about 9 months, which is the fastest they've ever had a trainee manager become promoted to that level. So that was great. And then I was there for about 2 years. And then they called me to head office because they found out that I was sleeping with the restaurant manageress. And which was against the rules. You weren't allowed to fraternize with the staff.
Right.
And we were practically living together at the time. So I said, no, you're not going to tell me how to run my private life as well. And I walked out. And I got into computers. I bought a Spectrum.
Mm.
My first computer was an Acorn Atom
Right.
with floating point ROM.
Ah.
So a good one. And it cleaned me out because I had absolutely no money, but it was important for me to get because I really wanted to get into computers. But programming baffled me, and unlike yourself, I had no skills in artwork or anything like that. I felt I had a bit of a creative element, but I was unable to turn that into physical art or anything like that. I tried with programming, couldn't really grasp it. So I typed in a few listings from magazines as you did in those days, and then I bought a Spectrum, which was a lot more straightforward. The Sinclair Spectrum just came out, and I bought one, and I thought, this is great. I love this. So I decided I would sell games, computer games, and I rented some shelves in the local video library, as they were then. And within 12 months, I'd made enough money to open up my own shop in the most prestigious high street in Liverpool, which is a bit of an oxymoron, but there you go. So I opened a shop called Blue Chip in Allerton Road, Liverpool, and I did okay. For going back, this is about 1983. Um, but it wasn't for me. I'm not a shopkeeper. I can't deal with the public very well. But I enjoyed it, and it did all right. And then I got a call from John Woods one day, who I was friendly with. He was the MD of Ocean. I knew David as well, sort of, but not as well as John. And we were chatting, and he said, "Look, we've got this games company here. Do you fancy joining us? We need someone who knows about games." And although I couldn't program and I couldn't do artwork, I knew what games would sell, and because I was selling them, and I knew I played them as well, and
Yeah.
so I had a reasonable feel. And because of my background in management, I felt that sounded okay. So they took me on as, at the time, software manager, because there was no one actually overseeing the development of Ocean.
Yeah.
So I went in, and and that was the start of my career in computer games and video games and console games and everything else, which lasted up until recently.
Ah. What was your biggest surprise when you went in and dealt with? Because I mean, you've been working with normal people up to then, haven't you? So what was it like working with programmers and artists and that sort of?
It was very different. I mean, I got to know quite a few. Liverpool, fortunately, which is where I lived, was the hub for games development back in the early days. We had software projects, we had Bug Bite, we had Imagine, of course, we had Thor, which became Odin, and they were major games publishers back then. And I knew them all. I used to hang out with them. I used to go around there. They were mates. So I understood the culture, if you like, but these were very, very small companies, relatively speaking. So when I went to Ocean, it wasn't too much of a shock. They had some good guys in-house, the likes of David Collier, Joffa Smith, Brian Buchan, Mike Webb, that they were all, talented developers, and of course Martin Galway on the music side. But there wasn't enough of them to actually do the games that were being fed to them, because John Woods was going out there and getting licenses. So, the infamous Knight Rider and Miami Vice, Street Hawk, Miami Vice, they were given to outsiders, if you like. They were given to freelancers, which was at that time were bedroom programmers, basically. And what was happening is, because there was no one overseeing them, they'd advertise and say, can someone write games? And I remember there was a company, I can't remember the name of the studio, in Brighton, say, yeah, we can do it. And Ocean would say, okay, how much do you want to write the game of Knight Rider? And they'd say $5,000 or whatever it was at the time, which back then was, a lot of money. So they'd get an advance of maybe 50%, $2,500, and they just smoke it and drink it away. And then 2 months later, when they realized they had to deliver something, then they'd start working, do a few weeks, and send something in to get a bit more money. And of course, the quality was dire. And so, having identified all of this, I realized that the only way we could really get quality product was to bring as much as possible in-house, and increase the headcount in-house, become a much, much larger studio, and feed. And that's basically what I did, and brought in some really, really talented people. And it went from there. I mean, and then also sourcing more reliable and talented freelance companies, because we still couldn't do everything in-house, but we had to be a lot more selective about the third-party developers we were using. And so that was the sort of the start of the whole Ocean renaissance, I guess.
Speaking of Imagine, obviously that there was a massive blow to the industry when they just went pop just overnight, basically, and they were based in Liverpool, as you said. So, what were the thoughts behind buying up the name and the back catalogue from
It
Ocean?
was it was purely a marketing thing. I mean, the label, the brand, the Imagine brand was very strong and very well known. So it made sense to pick that up. And the idea was, and I think this was David's idea, was to actually market our coin-op conversions under the Imagine brand. So you had familiar branding plus familiar titles, and it worked. I mean, I think we picked it up for relatively little, because the liquidators were looking to get as much money as possible, and who else would pay for the brand? So yeah, Ocean picked it up, and we used it for a number of years. But yeah, it's a shame. However, at least we acknowledge the value of the brand, which sort of, jumping ahead, and I'm just thinking about this now, makes me think about when Infogrames ultimately bought Ocean. They didn't have that same attitude. It was basically, they were just looking to expand, and they were looking to do something that would jack up their share price, and by acquiring a large, well-known company, that's what they did. But they didn't use the brand at all. And the Ocean brand arguably was stronger than the Infogrames brand.
Oh, definitely.
But they, as soon as they bought the company, they dropped it. They dropped the brand. And I never really did understand that, because
Yeah.
it was strong, it was well known, it was a great logo designed by Steve Blower or Bob Wakelin, and a lot of people had an enormous amount of affection for it. So I never really understood. Well, I did understand why they did it, but it didn't make sense to me.
Yeah. Well, obviously, Ocean was known as you were great at getting sorts of fantastic film and comic book licensing as well as coin-op licensing. How would you go about typically getting a film license?
It's quite interesting because it started off us sourcing films and TV shows that were already out, so they'd proved themselves. They were good. They had brand recognition, which is what we were talking about before. So we'd get the likes of Knight Rider and Miami Vice and Top Gun. They were already out in the cinema, and movie companies, they didn't really see computer games as being anything significant in terms of their revenue line. So if we said we'd give them $10,000-$20,000 as a guarantee, they'd say that's very nice, thank you very much, realizing that they probably wouldn't see anything more than that, but it's $20,000 they wouldn't otherwise get. And so that happened, and we took Platoon and stuff like that. But the big sea change came with RoboCop, and we got that at script stage.
Mm.
Because we'd done Platoon and it had a small measure of success, or a decent measure of success. So Orion Pictures, the company behind Platoon, sent us a script and said, we think you'd like this to make a game of. And it was RoboCop. And this was purely at script stage. And I was the only one who read the scripts because I love movies. That was my big passion. And so I sort of consumed the script in one go, and I thought, this is great if they make it well. And I knew the director Van Verhoeven, Paul Verhoeven, had a pretty good track record even then, and Paul Weller was a good actor. And I read that and I thought, well, okay, if they do it right, it could be amazing. If they do it wrong, it's going to be a cheesy B movie. And it was a coin toss, but I think because of Verhoeven, I think I had a bit more faith. So I said, well, let's go for it. And we paid Orion the $20,000 or whatever it was for RoboCop. And of course, it became phenomenal. The movie was fantastic, and I think we did a pretty good job of the game, and that changed everything. Because it was the first game, I believe, to sell 1 million units, 1 million copies, which in those days was massive. We're talking about an industry that was still quite niche. And we started sending royalty checks to Orion, which is something no one in the movie industry had ever seen before. They'd get their advance, and that was as much as they expected. But all of a sudden, these royalty checks started coming in. Then they realized that computer games stroke video games were a profit center in itself, and they started to take us a lot more seriously. And then we started getting a lot more scripts and being invited to licensing meetings. And I remember Batman the movie, we were there with all the toy companies and all the people who typically license the IP to make toys from, or apparel, get clothes, all sorts of things. And then us, this little video games company. And it was brilliant. And because Batman particularly was being made on set in Pinewood in London, I had complete access to go there whenever I liked, and it was wonderful. So, excuse me, that started the whole craze, if you like, for licensing, and I was inundated with scripts, which I read. I read every single script, and I've still got some of them in my cupboard because they're quite precious to me. And it was great. So I was dealing with the two loves of my life, the movies and the video games. It was a great combination.
Did they send you some scripts to? I mean, obviously they sent you the RoboCop one, but what was the weirdest script that you ever got asked to evaluate for a game?
Um, the weirdest one, I've still got it actually. There were two. One was a bit questionable, which was Silence of the Lambs, which, when you think about it, was difficult to make a game of. I wouldn't have liked
Yeah.
it. But the oddest one was Mississippi Burning.
All
And
right.
that was a movie with Gene Hackman about the Ku Klux Klan and the racist wars in Mississippi, and cross burning, and it was awful, awful racist stuff. And they sent me the script. How the hell would you even think about making a game? Why would you send me? I mean, the script was great. It was a great movie, but totally inappropriate. But the most the most inappropriate script we actually did make a game of was a movie called Radio Flyer, which was a fantasy movie about a boy, a child, who Radio Flyer is a little American go-kart, if you like, a very basic go-kart, and he made it fly. But it was in his imagination because he was being abused, and it was his escape from reality. Well, there's a great subject for a video, child abuse. But we'd already committed to it, and they changed it. We had some weird ones. I think another one they sent me was Rain Man.
Oh, really? How are you going to do that?
On the matchsticks. I don't know.
Well, once you'd signed a license, how much did the film companies get involved with it? I mean, did they meddle quite a lot with the game design, or
there was always an approval process. And I remember Batman the movie was a good one. And Batman's ears are too long. We had to cut down his ears by a couple of pixels. We weren't allowed to have Robert De Niro's image in the game, but we could have Kevin Costner's because he was less known. So we digitalized the loading screen, stuff like that, but we couldn't have Robert De Niro. Bruce Willis was manic and very possessive about his Hudson Hawk, about his image and what we could and couldn't use. We could generally use the film artwork, the stuff you have on the poster, for the cover of the game, which is basically what you pay for when you're licensing. It's that brand, that recognition. But Untouchables, they always used to look at the game. Probably the weirdest one we did was The Simpsons. And we submitted the Simpsons game to Fox, and it came back rejected because Bart's blink is off model. So it was his blink. And with the Sims, so the artists had done it with a normal blink where the top eyelid goes to the bottom of the eye, but the Simpsons blink so that the both bottom and top eyelids meet in the middle. And so we had to change all the animations of the Simpsons eyes. So it's stuff like that, but we got through it. I mean, they were mostly, because we'd send conceptual stuff and storyboards and whatnot well in advance, we didn't get any real big surprises at the end. If we had to cut down Batman's ears by a pixel or two, it wasn't the end of the world, because you do it with one character and it's done for the whole game.
Yeah. Were there any licenses that you tried to get but couldn't get hold of?
Yeah, I think Microsoft nabbed Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles from us. We really wanted that one. And also, I mentioned The Simpsons before. We didn't actually get The Simpsons license. It was Acclaim who nabbed that one. And we got the sub rights because obviously there were various European computers like the Spectrum and the Dragon and goodness knows what, MSX even, that weren't popular in the States, and Acclaim weren't interested in them. So we sub-licensed the game to develop and publish the sort of European formats. But that was a bit of frustrating to me, because I recall I spent a lot of time in Hollywood because of the whole movie thing. And I recall in the very early days of The Simpsons, seeing it and going back and saying, we've got to get this license. I think it's going to be huge. They said, oh, it's a cartoon. We don't want to get it. No. And then a year later, when it was a phenomenon, then obviously Acclaim beat us to it. We could have got it not just early on, but for buttons, because it obviously wasn't proven then.
Yeah. Were there any licenses you got that you regretted later?
Well, do we regret? Yeah, probably the biggest regret and shock, I guess, for me personally. I read this amazing script. It was fantastic. The director had a great track record. The actor in it was the best known actor in the world. And it had everything going for it. I scooped it up. So we'll get this one, and we got it. and it was Hudson Hawk.
Oh,
And
right.
the original script, which I think I may still have, was excellent. It was funny, it was exciting, had everything. The problem is Bruce Willis took the whole thing over and rewrote it and redesigned it for, I think, to make it more of a vehicle for him personally,
Right.
and less emphasis on the other characters. And it really wasn't the thing that hit the screen at the end, the film that hit the screen at the end, bore very little resemblance to the script that I read a couple of years earlier. So that was maybe a regret, if you like. But who's to know? It was
Yeah.
good.
Hmm. How well did Hudson Hawk do in the end? Because it wasn't a bad game, I don't think, from what I
Game
remember.
was okay. It was a bit cookie cutter. I think special effects did that for us. It was derivative. It was a platform game. There were crates and stuff like that.
Hmm.
It was okay. I think it was quite hard actually. I think it was quite a difficult game. But it did okay. I think, even though the film flopped, there was recognition. And at the end of the day, as I say, part of what we pay for is that brand recognition. It's always it went towards the granny, what we used to call the granny purchase. So granny knows that little Johnny has a computer and loves computer games. So she goes into the shops and to WH Smith's as it would be back then, and sees this array of cassette tapes on the wall and doesn't have the faintest idea. But then she sees Rambo, or she
Ah,
sees Superman, or she sees uh, Spider-Man, whatever. And that was what we call the granny purchase. And that's the core of what the film licenses and TV licenses were all about. It was all about recognition. It's marketing. That's
yeah.
all.
So did you do a lot of like smooching over in Los Angeles and Hollywood with the big actors and directors?
Yeah, I had a whale of a time.
Yes.
It was phenomenal. I mean, I think I appreciated it back then, but I was on the film sets. I was watching the rushes of Batman with Tim Burton. At the end of the day, I was actually in a movie. There was Nightbreed we did with Clive Barker, and we got chatting. He said, "Would you like to be in the movie?" I said, "Yeah." So I was 2 hours in prosthetics and made up as one of the background monsters. I met pretty much everyone, the likes of Robin Williams and Dustin Hoffman on Hook, and having a creative meeting with Steven Spielberg on Jurassic Park. I mean, a literal one-to-one meeting. It was amazing times. It was about 5 or 6 years that was just incredible. I loved every minute of it. Yeah.
Well, you got involved with the game design in quite a few titles, didn't you? And you mentioned to me before three in particular. So the Untouchable. So what sort of thing did you bring to the design there, personally?
Um, I think, well, Platoon was the first one. What I do is, having read the script
Hmm.
and saying, okay, we'll do that, then I think it was essentially my initial job to pluck the relevant scenes from that film that would make a decent interactive section of the game.
Hmm.
And because there were several different scenes that lent themselves and quite different in terms of how they were presented, then we started making these multi-format games. So there'd be a shoot 'em up element, and then there'd be a platform element, and maybe a puzzle element, and we'd combine it to give as much variety as possible. And that I think happened first in Platoon, and then Untouchables was a great example, and of course Batman the movie. And I remember one thing I will take credit for. Well, two things I'll take credit for. One was the photo fit identification section in RoboCop.
Oh yeah, I
I
remember
did
that.
come up with that, which is quite a simple idea. But the other one, which I was quite proud of, was the Batmobile section in the Batman game. And to turn the corners, you had to shoot out a grappling hook, which would wrap around the lamppost so that your car would corner very, very sharply, which is actually in the movie.
Hmm.
And when I read that bit, I thought we must put that in the game. So when I was speaking to the guys who were designing it, I said we really should do this, and it worked really well. So I will take credit for those. But generally it was more of overseeing the whole development thing, and the guys were great. I mean, we had genius developers. I
Hmm.
mean, the guys who designed our games, the Simon Butlers and Mike Lambs and Warren Lancashires, James Higgins, John Bramwood, all these people, they were incredibly creative, and I wouldn't begin to start telling them they should do this and they should do that. They had their own. Excuse me a second. Sorry. Okay. So, um, sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
Yeah, the design.
Yes, and they were so competent, more than
Hmm.
competent, that I sort of just stayed on the sidelines. Early on, we'd have design meetings, but later on, there was enough faith and trust and confidence in them to let them get on with it because they knew what they were doing.
That said, were there any moments where they came up with a part of a design element to a game that you just thought, oh my God, and you had to step in and say, no, 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 no?
Not that I recall. I actually, I actually don't recall any issues of that nature. Um, I mean, bear in mind, everyone was under these really, really tight deadlines and had to uh, make something in an unrealistic time frame, which would be unheard of these days. We had to turn these things around in 3 months, maybe 6 months for a 16-bit game, which doesn't give you an awful lot of time to tweak and play around with designs. You had to know what you were doing. By and large, a lot of the time we made it up as we went along. But what I didn't leave enough time for at the end of the game was the tweaking,
Hmm.
was the difficulty, tweaking and the testing and everything else. We were okay with bugs. We usually got rid of those. But, some of the games were maybe too difficult, and they could have been a little bit kinder. But some we got spot on. I remember Renegade was a very, very popular
Hmm.
game, and the guys did, and that was a coin conversion, and they did a great job on that. And it was so popular and successful that we created our own sequel called Target Renegade. And that was actually even more successful than the original coin op. And that's something we developed ourselves because obviously developing directly for the computer, the idiosyncrasies and the limitations, so
Yeah.
you can design the game to fit the computer better, rather than when you're doing a conversion, you're fitting a quart into a pint pot and it's a bit more challenging.
Yeah. Well, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, that was a very strange license to get, wasn't it? So how did all that come about?
To be honest with you, that was just a few months before my time.
Oh, was
So
it?
I wasn't involved with that. But I mean, Frankie was at the time was the most popular band,
Hmm.
certainly in the UK. And again, it was all about recognition. It was all about having the music to use with the game. And I remember Denton Designs, who were really off the wall. I mean, you talk about creative. They took that word and times 10, and
Yeah.
they were incredible, but very, I don't know what they were smoking at the time. I've got a good idea, but I think that came across in the game. It was very, very surreal, but it was what lent itself to the music, and
Yeah.
it was quite unique in its way.
Hmm. Sticking on licenses just for a little bit longer. So Jurassic Park, that was the first ever $1 million license that you paid for. So was there a lot of pressure on the studio? Was there any conflict inside the studio to not greenlight that because of the obvious risk involved?
I, I don't think so. I mean, the problem was the timing. Again, we
Mm.
wanted to make something groundbreaking. But again, you have this very narrow window in which to develop a game based on what became the most popular movie of all time in its day.
Mm.
So we knew it was going to be huge. and we had access to all the materials. I remember not just the meeting with Spielberg, but Stan Winston took me around his workshop and showed me the way they were building the animatronic dinosaurs. And then Phil Tippett was showing me the computer stuff on his Silicon graphics machines. I mean, that was phenomenal. And then I remember asking for the computer. I said, to save us redesigning the models, can you send us the computer data? And he said, well, we can send you some of it, but of course we had no computers that could convert any of that stuff.
Yeah.
It was a bit ambitious, but no, I mean, there was a lot of pressure to get it right. It wasn't a bad game. A couple of the formats were okay. I personally was very, very disappointed, not in the developers, because they did what they could in the time they were given, but
Yeah.
in delivering what I think could have been a much, much better game had we been given more time. But the idea was we had to release it whilst the movie was on the crest of the wave, because that's the whole point. And when you're paying $1 million for a movie license in those days, there's an awful lot on the line there.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think your biggest personal challenge was throughout your entire career at Ocean? Sorry, it's a big question, that.
I think it was difficult because as the in-house facility grew, I took on help, which was back then they became producers, but there was no such thing as a game producer then. But you know that there was Lorraine came on board and Colin Gordon and a few other people, because I couldn't do, I think Delegation was difficult for me, in retrospect and looking back now, because I didn't want anyone else to oversee the games development. I didn't want anyone else to be hiring and firing the development staff. I didn't want anyone else to be in the design meetings. I didn't want anyone else to be licensing the games from Hollywood. I didn't want anyone else to be sitting in the sets, of course, and going and watching the films being made. And so, but obviously, you know, as we got bigger and bigger, it was just ridiculous to imagine that anyone could do all of that stuff. So Delegation, I think I got fine with it a little later on, but it was just that period where I don't think I came to terms with it very well myself. But I also, I think, wanted passionately to have more original games, because in tandem with developing all of these, the idea of, in my mind, for the company was to continue making licensed games, which and coin ops and everything else, which pays the bills and makes the money, and at the same time invest in independent companies like the likes of Sensible Software and a few others, who would be bringing out innovative, groundbreaking, new game mechanics and concepts. DID was another one. I was very proud of DID. They were great, and their stuff really did sell well. Sensible Stuff was a bit quirky and therefore was difficult to sell. But there were other games like Billy the Kid. I remember there was one called Ico. There was one called Lost Patrol, which was brilliant, about the Vietnam War. But again, when we're marketing the likes of Batman and Untouchables, which are familiar, it's very difficult to put next to it and put as much energy into a title called Lost Patrol about the Vietnam War, or Whiz Kid about this bouncing ball. Very difficult to sell. Our marketing department were great at selling the familiar stuff, but found it a little bit more difficult, perhaps, to sell the unknown stuff. And that's, as time went on, that's where my passion was leaning more towards. And I was very, very keen on getting the in-house guys to start thinking a little bit more out of the box and creating something that wasn't necessarily licensed.
Right. Okay. Well, things started to change towards was it the year 2000? I think when Infogrames went onto the stock exchange, and well, I was
Yeah.
working for Gremlin at the time, and they took Gremlin and then Ocean as well. So it was the end of an era, really, because they were the two big Keystone studios, weren't they? You know, the publishers.
I think it was quite a bit earlier than that. I think it was mid-90s, because I left around 93, 94, maybe
Right.
um, before all that happened. So yeah, it just they acquired Ocean, and just the brand, as we said before, just went into oblivion, which was a huge shame.
Yeah. Why did you leave at that time? Was it influenced by the takeover? Did you have
Now,
knowledge about it?
I will reveal one day, but now is not the appropriate time. But
Right.
uh, no, there were personal reasons, and I had a bit of a falling out
Okay.
with people.
Okay, fair enough. Well, you stayed in games, didn't you, after Ocean?
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, games was, frankly, it was all I knew. I mean, I've been doing it pretty much my entire working life. So I had all this experience, and then I was headhunted or approached by Telstar, which at the time was the biggest independent record company in Europe. And they decided music was getting a little bit more difficult to sell, and they decided they wanted to get into video games. The problem was, just at that time, and I did it, and I was delighted, and it brought me down here to London. I'm living in Surrey now, in the same house we moved to 30 years ago, and it was great, but up until that point, games development was for the smaller consoles, the Nintendo, the Amiga, the home computers, a bit of PC. And the games generally cost about 50, by then, about £50,000, up to maybe 100,000 for a really ambitious game.
Mm.
We're talking about mid 90s, well, 20 years ago, so 30 years ago, so mid 90s. What happened at that point was PlayStation was launched, PlayStation was introduced, and all of a sudden, because of the phenomenal capability of that console compared to what had gone before, development costs suddenly got into the seven-figure realm.
Yeah.
So from £50,000, it was suddenly £1 million or $1 million to develop a game, which I know these days is very, very little, but then it was massive. So we obviously latched on to that, and in fact, Telstar was the first company, the first third-party games publisher to publish a game for the PlayStation. It was a game called Lone Soldier, and apart from Sony's first-party games, it was only Lone Soldier that came out at the same time, which I was very proud of. But of course, the cost of these things was ridiculous, and it became, beforehand, if it cost you £50,000 dollars to make a game, and you were churning these things out, if one or two failed, it wasn't the end of the world. The others would pick up the slack. But at $1 million a throw, that becomes a very, very significant gamble. And so it was difficult. It was very, very difficult to make games in that era, because there was a mindset, and they'd got into this business thinking the budgets were, six figures, low six figures, and here they were suddenly becoming seven figures. So it was difficult. And then, of course, and not just because of the number of people, but all of a sudden, I mentioned the hardware before, silicon graphics.
Mm.
Everyone had to have a silicon graphics computer. You probably worked on them.
Yeah.
But if you're doing 3D games, you had to have a 3D graphics computer, and the Silicon Graphics was the one to have. And I remember Alias making fortunes from us when we bought some machines. So all the costs just exponentially increased. And the sad thing is, the UK has never been well served by investors, by the investment community. The US had Silicon Valley, games were getting big, the investors were throwing massive amounts of money at these games developers stroke publishers because they saw this was an entertainment form that was going to become bigger than movies, than music, than everything else. But the UK just could not get their heads around it. And still to this day, you know, we as a nation have always struggled to get the support of those financial institutions. And that's why we lost a lot of good talent to the US back in the early days. I remember a lot of our guys having to leave saying, look, sorry, but we've been offered twice the salary, living in the sunshine, you know, working on these fantastic games, everything else. We've got to go to LA. And there was this, I won't say a mass exodus, but quite an exodus out there. And I don't blame them. And what's interesting is you look back then and more recently, you look at some of the top people in some of the companies, and a lot of them are Brits. A lot of them are people who went over in that period, not just Motion, but from various companies. And they did incredibly well. But those opportunities weren't available here because for some reason, I don't know. I mean, even France, that allowed Infogrames to take over Ocean because they had a culture that recognized the potential of video games. The UK never did. And it's always been a source of frustration, even today.
How do you see the industry now?
Um,
With it being sort of Steam-based, you know, downloadable games, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that migration is complete. I think, you know, the video games industry is now owned by the US and to a much lesser extent Asia. I mean, I would have said in the old days Japan, but now it's as much China and Korea. And we've lost that advantage because I think technically and creatively, we had the best minds here. I think the games industry overall has changed a lot because of lack of innovation. You know, there's always been the big companies, the big publishers didn't like to take chances. So they wanted a game that was like Batman or was like Gran Turismo or in these genres which were tried and tested. Bethesda were maybe an exception to that. They did their games were by and large very groundbreaking. They got it right, and obviously, you know, you got Rockstar who release one game every decade, but they're in no rush to do so because what they release is phenomenal. But everyone else sticks to the tried and tested, and as a result, there's very little true innovation. And I haven't seen a truly original game mechanic, an enjoyable game mechanic for a long, long time. I mean, you'd occasionally get something absolutely novel like Portal. And even then, I'm quoting that game, probably having to go back 20 years or 15 years to when that was released. I mean, where are the portals of, you know, I remember Tomb Raider coming out for the first PlayStation. It was the first 3D immersive game that actually, it was amazing. There was never anything like that before, not to that sophistication. And then you had the open world and the multiplayer and all that stuff, these different evolutions. But the true revolution and innovation has come from the independence on mobile, because the mobiles were obviously cheap to develop on. So it didn't need these big developer publishers. And the innovative stuff has come from that quarter. And I think we've got to leave it to these indies to galvanize our industry, the games industry, and make it what it once was. We need pioneers. We need innovators, people who are thinking outside of the box to give us new immersive experiences, new interactive experiences, new games mechanics, because the technology we have available to us now is phenomenal. It's just incredible compared to what we had back in the day. We were putting games into 16K computers with big pixels. I mean, you couldn't even get a title, let alone a title screen, title into 16K these days. There's so much at your disposal, and we really need. And with the advent of some form of virtual reality or augmented reality, I mean, these goggles, maybe not, but something's going to come along which will allow people to experiment with new immersive interactive techniques. That's what I'm excited about. But the derivative stuff that keeps coming out, and yeah, it's good. I still play games. I don't know what's happened to Bethesda. Well, I do know what's happened to Bethesda. They were bought by Microsoft, but I haven't seen much coming from them. And I used to love my every 2 year Fallout release, or Fallout type Skyrim, whatever release. I don't know what's happened there. There's still the Call of Duties, but the God of War, I love those. The Horizon New Dawn, those are great. But really, they are quite samey, and we just want something maybe a little bit different. And someone out there is going to come up with it, I hope, and they should be very well rewarded for it.
Mm. You've got your own legacy is fantastic. I mean, it's decades long. You've produced so many brilliant games. I know you said you've left games now. What are your plans for the future? Have you got anything lined up?
I'm just hoping to keep alive now. It's a survival game. That's the big game of all. There's an innovative one. I am. I'm pretty much retired. I'm still chairman of a couple of companies. I still have massive love for the games industry. I've got lots and lots of friends in the business. I've fallen out with very few people over the 40 years. And so I still catch up. I still speak to many of the Ocean guys, and everyone else I've worked with. But I'm retired now to all intents and purposes, and now actually traveling around to enjoy bits of the world which before I only ever saw from the inside of an office or from a hotel room. So I'm just relaxing now, and it's nice to be stress free for the first time in my life.
Well, I've really enjoyed the chat. Thanks for joining us. It's been amazing. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for asking me, Sean. I've really enjoyed it. It's always nice to sort of reminisce, and somewhere in the pockets of my brain I can bring out something that I hadn't thought about for decades. And you've done that for me. So thanks very much indeed.
Oh, my pleasure. Nice seeing you again. But you take care. Thank you.
You too. Cheers, Sean.
Cheers,
Bye.
mate. Bye bye.